Welcome once again to our studies in the Gospel of Mark. Today we come to the short paragraph, chapter 1, verses 35 to 39, which reads as follows. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let's go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I've come." So he travelled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. In these studies we've already mentioned that the four separate accounts of Jesus' life, the books known as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, often report the same stories of Jesus. This is of course not surprising. They were all recording things that they, or those with whom they spoke, had seen for themselves, and inevitably they often reported the same events. However, each writer used the events they had witnessed or the reports that they'd received in different ways. They each then had their own story to tell, their accounts shaped by those to whom they were writing. So we've noticed that Mark has assembled his material so far as to make a number of important points for non-Jews or Gentiles who appear to have been his intended readership. He's convinced that Jesus was the promised Messiah, who was God incarnate and brought good news to the entire human race. Jesus came, he claims, to destroy the spiritual powers which keep men and women in darkness, and to bring to an end the consequences of the fall, above all dealing once and for all with our sin and guilt before God. And Mark has already recorded Jesus' invitation to 4 fishermen to become his followers, to step out with him and see where this might lead. With this in mind, we turn to the present passage and ask the question, why did Mark believe this incident, unrecorded in the other Gospels, was important enough to share with us? One reason may be the mention of Simon, or as he's better known, Peter. It has long been believed that Peter was the source upon whom Mark drew for writing his Gospel. It's also known that ancient writers often named in their narratives those who had supplied the information to them. So Mark seems here to confirm that Peter was the source of at least some of what he wrote. This is another encouragement to us to take seriously the fact that Mark's Gospel reports the testimonies of those who were present at the events he records. We're not dealing with myths and legends, but of events that actually took place in the history of our world and for which we have the witnesses' testimony. However, there is surely much more here than merely a claim to truthfulness, important as undoubtedly that is. What does appear significant then is the reference to Jesus' prayer life. Clearly, even though he was the Son of God, while he lived here on earth, he regarded prayer as vital. So what do we understand by prayer? I think that as we read the accounts of Jesus' life, the fundamental meaning of prayer is that this is an experience of fellowship with God. And when we enjoy the privilege of good friendships, we love to spend time with our friends, to talk to them and enjoy their conversations with us, and sometimes simply delight in those moments when no words are exchanged, but we enjoy wordless intimacy. Marriage at its best perhaps illustrates this as well as anything else. As we read through the accounts of Jesus' life, it seems that this is what prayer meant for him. Prayer was the opportunity to find time away from the busyness of life and enjoy all the privileges of intimacy with his Heavenly Father. And if this is what prayer means, we can understand why Jesus made it a priority, or perhaps better, found every opportunity to enjoy it. However, on each occasion in which Jesus is said to retire to pray, In Mark's Gospel, it is at those critical moments in which the question is, what sort of Messiah is Jesus going to be? And that's true here. The temptation existed for him to remain where he was, popular in Capernaum. But Jesus turned his back on this path for what we will discover was a far more demanding role, which will involve hardship, misunderstanding, unpopularity, and even death. And since Jesus' prayer life is often mentioned in this way before significant and challenging events in his life, we can assume that for him fellowship with his Father strengthened him for the demands that lay before him. His prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane, which we will study later, are the best example of this. With this in our minds, we can turn to the rest of the passage. In our last study, we learned that Jesus' first steps in ministry were met with popular acclaim. The whole town of Capernaum welcomed him and sought him out, especially for healing. Meanwhile, Simon Peter and his friends must have been able to bask in the reflected glory. After all, it was Simon Peter's home before which the whole community gathered. So it comes as no surprise that Simon Peter and his friends came looking for Jesus and reported the local community's acclaim. They all wanted more of Jesus. But Jesus' response was short and pointed. Let's go somewhere else. And he gives the reason. I have come, he says, to preach. Notice then that what Mark reports took place next. Jesus went through Galilee of the nations, teaching, at first in the Jewish synagogues as he had in Capernaum. We're not told of the response, but we can assume it was similar to that of Capernaum. However, Mark singles out one consequence. Jesus continued to drive out demons. Demon possession can be a controversial subject, and I don't want to say much about it here. Nevertheless, two things can and I think should be said. The first is that it does appear to be a universal phenomenon. But the second, more important point is this. The presence of Jesus appears to have awakened increased demonic activity. However, wherever he went, he demonstrated absolute authority over the powers of darkness. In this way, he demonstrated who he truly was and is, the Son of God. And this is, I believe, what Mark wants us to grasp. Jesus was not a local wonder worker and guru, but in an unprecedented way, he encountered and overthrew the powers of darkness, and in this way revealed in his teaching, his actions, and simply by being who he was, that he was and remains the author and source of unspeakably good news. Once again then, Mark challenges us to reflect and respond to what he records. However, before we conclude this study, there are several other things I think we should notice. The first is that Jesus, as we've already observed, turns his back on merely popular acclaim, and perhaps gently hints to his little band of followers that following him will not necessarily involve them in basking in his glory. This will become very much clearer in the coming chapters. For Jesus to go elsewhere, as he says here, and proclaim good news will ultimately lead to his death. His followers will have to discover that their master came to be regarded as a common criminal. And by the time Mark wrote his gospel, persecution and martyrdom was a present reality. We know that Stephen and James, Jesus' half-brother, were martyred only a few years later. And Saul, who later became the Apostle Paul, until he became a Christian, was active in persecuting a church that found itself widely dispersed as a result. It may be then that Mark is gently reminding us that following Jesus means that such experiences may well be ours too. This is interesting. By now we can have no doubt but that Mark wants to convince all his readers that they should become Christians. He has no doubt that he is the bearer of good news. However, he also seems to be warning us not to become glory seekers, but to understand that by becoming Christians we may also discover we're unpopular, criminal followers of a criminal, persecuted and even martyred. Some of you listening to this talk will know that this is true in your own circumstances. Accepting the good news may demand everything of us, as it did for Jesus. So if we are Christians or become one, we have to be ready to take up our cross to follow Jesus. This is not the whole picture, but it is something we need to recognize. It's tempting to want the glory without the suffering. We also notice that Mark seems to imply that Jesus indicated that following him involves Christian believers in being co-workers with Jesus, in seeking to free men and women from the bondage to sin. So at one and the same time, Jesus offers these representative disciples an enormous privilege, but a highly demanding one. The privilege is that of sharing with him in the proclamation of God's good news, and such, as is implied here, involves effort. This does not mean, of course, all of us are called to be preachers in the sense the disciples would become as fishers of people, but this passage reminds us that Christians have an obligation to strain every nerve to ensure that Christ is made known. I think then that at this point I'm speaking to Christians, making Jesus known ought to be a priority in our corporate and individual lives. Working out how we can best do this requires thought and prayer, and a recognition of the specific gifts God has given us, and how they can be used to help others know about Jesus. But however we reach our conclusion, the missionary call to the church and all its members remains unchanged today. Linked with this is the fact that Mark has introduced Galilee as Galilee of the Gentiles by his quotation from Isaiah right at the beginning of this chapter. So, though Jesus began teaching in the Jewish synagogues, he went out to the whole of Galilee. As we've already noticed, this was one of the most cosmopolitan areas in the ancient world. Mark, who appears, as we've already suggested, to have been writing his book with non-Jewish Gentiles especially in mind, cannot have failed to make the connection. The good news is a gospel for all people. The differences between Jews and Gentile non-Jews were considerable in terms of their ethnicity, nationhood, social, economic, cultural and educational backgrounds. For a while Jesus will concentrate upon the Jewish population of the Galilee. But Mark recognizes that implicit in his ministry from its earliest days was Jesus' recognition that his kingdom was unbounded and the good news is for all. The early Christian believers, while hesitant at first, were quick to understand this, and responsibility rests on all their successors today to make even the most distant lands hear the good news. It was when he understood this that hesitant Thomas the Apostle travelled in the earliest years of the Christian church to the subcontinent, ministering what is now modern Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, before being martyred in Chennai. In more recent times, Christians have moved out from these and virtually every country throughout the world to speak of the good news in Jesus. The call has not changed. But we need to draw our reflections to a conclusion. Once again in this passage, Mark sets before all his readers the challenge created for all of us by Jesus' words and actions. Mark insists that he is recording accurately the testimony of eyewitnesses to Jesus' life, and there are no good reasons for doubting his stories are true. But Mark is a realist. While the good news in Jesus offers life and light to a world in bondage to death and darkness, to follow Jesus comes at a cost. It demands that his followers seek to make him known everywhere, and very solemnly to recognize that disciple may be costly, even to the point of martyrdom.